When the doorbell rang, I saw the religious teacher standing outside. I hadn't expected him to show up given the storm, but it seemed he never took a day off. I invited him in, directed him to the drawing room, and called my sons to start their lesson. They rushed in, settling near him to begin studying. This teacher had been coming to our home for the last 6 months. My husband, Aslam, had arranged for him to teach the boys Arabic. Although I appreciated the instruction, I never truly liked the teacher himself. I didn't have much fondness for overly religious figures, and something about his demeanor always made me uncomfortable. His gaze often carried a strange intensity, almost a sting whenever he looked at me. Yet because the children needed lessons, we kept him on. Out of courtesy, I made sure to extend the usual hospitality. That day was no different. I prepared tea and brought it to him, but as I placed it down, I noticed the same sharp look in his eyes. It made me uneasy, as if my very presence was under scrutiny. He soon turned back to teaching, but his penetrating stare lingered in my mind. I couldn't quite shake the discomfort, even as I busied myself around the house. Normally, I would have left the boys with him while I attended to household tasks. However, the storm had me anxious, and I had finished all my work early. The unsettling weather and the tutor's presence made me decide to stay close. I sat quietly in a corner of the drawing room, keeping an eye on the lesson. Rain lashed against the windows and thunder rolled in waves, making my heart race. Even as I sat there, I kept glancing at the clock, hoping the weather would improve. After some time, the teacher concluded the lesson and prepared to leave. By then, the rain had grown heavier, the sky was dark, and visibility outside was nearly zero. As he rose, I stopped him. "It's pouring too hard," I said. "Please wait until it eases up." He hesitated, insisting he could manage the trip back. It seemed as though he didn't want to stay too long in Aslam's absence, but I was persistent. The storm was relentless, and the very thought of venturing out into it made me uneasy for him as well. "It's really not safe. Just wait a little longer," I urged again. Finally, he gave in and sat back down. My home was small, 2 connected rooms, a courtyard, a kitchen, and a bathroom outside. I left him in the drawing room and went into my bedroom, where the children and I usually slept. Time crawled by, and the rain showed no signs of letting up. I kept checking the clock, listening to the thunder rumble overhead. By the time it was dinner, the downpour still hadn't eased. I quickly prepared a meal and brought it to the teacher and my children, hoping that by the time we finished, the weather would improve enough for him to leave safely. The religious tutor seemed very hungry. He ate heartily along with the children. I too had my dinner quietly in my bedroom and then washed the dishes. But the rain showed no sign of letting up. Gradually, the clock hands moved closer and closer to midnight. But the downpour continued unabated. The tutor and the children remained in the drawing room, while I lay down in my bedroom, utterly exhausted. I found myself growing increasingly angry at my husband, Aslam. Of all days, he had chosen this stormy weather to travel to another city. He was so consumed by his business that he paid no heed to day or night, heat or cold. When the thought of traveling struck him, he would leave without a second thought, abandoning me and the children. This time had been no different. I had warned him about the rain, pleaded with him not to leave, but he hadn't listened. Now here I was, left alone to deal with this nerve-wracking situation. Inwardly, I began praying for the rain to stop. I was upset not only with Aslam, but also with myself, regretting my decision to ask the religious tutor to stay. He had been ready to leave that evening, and I had been the one to insist he stay because of the storm. Now, hours later, he was still in my home, and I couldn't very well ask him to leave in the middle of the night. The darkness outside had deepened, and sending him out now felt impossible. I was stuck with him, and I knew I had no choice but to tolerate his presence. The night seemed unending. I tossed and turned in bed, my eyes frequently darting to the clock. It felt as though time itself had slowed down. When it finally reached 1 o'clock, I was still awake, my nerves frazzled by the storm outside and my own swirling thoughts. Eventually, sheer exhaustion took over, and I fell asleep. But when I woke up, I was shocked to my core, because at the foot of my bed, I saw the religious tutor. Let me backtrack a bit. My name is Zarina, and I have always been a rather timid person. As a child, even the smallest things would frighten me, whether it was darkness, rain, or simply being alone. These fears didn't fade as I grew older. If anything, they intensified. Whenever a thunderstorm began, I would shiver and tremble, unable to keep my fear at bay. Then Aslam entered my life, and from the moment I saw him, I fell in love. But my parents were completely opposed to the idea of us getting married. Their reasons were numerous, but the most significant one was Aslam's lack of family ties. He had no parents, no relatives that anyone could point to. He was a wealthy man with a flourishing business, but he had no connection to his family anymore. He had once told me that years ago he had quarreled with his parents and left his hometown for good. Since then, he had focused solely on building his life in this city, never looking back. My father couldn't accept the idea of me marrying someone who had completely severed ties with his family. He often said, "If he can leave his parents behind, what makes you think he won't leave you someday?" My father's doubts didn't end there. He was adamant about marrying me to the son of one of his friends, a deeply religious young man who had studied theology. The very idea of marrying someone so pious made me cringe. I was upfront with my father, refusing outright. I told him I had no interest in being tied down by someone who would use religion as an excuse to confine me to the four walls of a house. I was clear that I wanted to marry Aslam, no one else. My father argued with me constantly. "Aslam has no religious education," he said. "He grew up without his parents' guidance. He doesn't even know how to pray properly. How can someone like that provide you with a good life? Money and love aren't everything. When you choose a partner, you have to look at other qualities too. If the man is religious, then married life can be so much better. A devout man will care for your rights and never treat you unfairly. But Aslam? I've never even seen him pray. He's a man of indulgence." I rejected everything my father said. To me, Aslam was not the irresponsible, self-indulgent man my father described. Instead, I saw someone who had made a life for himself despite not having family support. I saw his independence and resilience, not his faults. I firmly believed that my father's proposed match, someone he thought was perfect simply because of his religious background, would have stifled me. I wasn't interested in marrying someone who would dictate how I dressed, how I behaved, or where I could go. I wanted a partner, not a warden. My father warned me time and again, "A religious man will ensure that you live a fair, balanced, and just life. Someone like Aslam, who isn't grounded in faith, can never offer you that stability. You're blinded by love and wealth. You don't see the bigger picture." But I was resolute. I wanted Aslam with all his imperfections. I didn't want a marriage based solely on religious principles. My father couldn't understand this. He saw religion as a guarantee for a successful marriage, while I saw it as a limitation. I wasn't willing to let someone else dictate my life based on their religious views. I wanted a relationship that allowed me to be myself, and I believed Islam could give me that, despite his flaws. My father's slap still stung in my memory. He had struck me with such force after I'd made a bitter remark about him wanting me to marry a religious man. He'd said I would regret my words one day, and though I tried to dismiss his warnings, his anger and disappointment lingered in my mind. It was the first time my father had ever raised his hand to me, and that moment left a scar, not just physically, but emotionally. It drove a wedge between us. From then on, I was determined to have my way. I decided I would marry Islam no matter what. My heart was consumed with love for him. At that time, my life revolved around Aslam. He would pick me up in his luxurious car, drive me around the city, and shower me with expensive gifts. I would sneak out under the pretense of going to college and spend hours with him. It had all started through a college friend. She introduced me to him when her brother brought him along to pick her up one day, and from that moment, our love story began. We quickly grew attached, but when my friend realized how serious I was about him, she tried to talk me out of it. "Aslam isn't the right guy for you," she would say. When I told Aslam about her warnings, he became defensive. "She's only trying to keep you away from me because she likes me herself," he claimed. "If I were so terrible, why would her own brother have introduced us?" His logic seemed sound, and I grew angry with my friend. I cut off my friendship with her and ended up isolating myself from most of my social circle. Aslam became my entire world. I wanted nothing more than to make him my life partner, but my parents wouldn't hear of it. They saw Islam as unsuitable. My father was especially adamant, saying he was not religious and had no family to speak of. He warned that a man who could leave his own parents behind would never stay loyal to me. I ignored him. I was in love and convinced that Islam was the one for me. My father suggested a match with the son of his friend, a pious young man, but I refused. I didn't want to marry someone who would confine me to the home under the pretext of religious principles. I wanted freedom and love, not restrictions. Despite my parents' protests, I defied them. The night I married Islam was also the night my father disowned me. He told me never to return home and said I was no longer his daughter. My heart ached, but my youthful determination told me I was doing the right thing. I believed that love would conquer all. Aslam and I began our married life together, and at first it felt like a dream. We had money, we had each other, and we thought we had all we needed. But the honeymoon phase didn't last long. Soon I began to see a different side of Aslam. He was stubborn. Once he made up his mind about something, he wouldn't budge. He wasn't interested in prayer or fasting. I wasn't overly religious myself, but I still made an effort to observe my faith. I fasted during Ramadan, prayed regularly, and tried to maintain some connection to my beliefs. But Islam wouldn't listen to my pleas for him to join me. He refused to fast, and our arguments about religion and spirituality became a constant source of tension. Aslam's frequent business trips only added to my struggles. He would travel to other cities for weeks at a time, leaving me behind. I hated being alone, and I told him so many times. "Take me with you," I begged, but he always refused. "It's not practical," he would say, and so I stayed home, lonely and fearful, especially during bad weather. Stormy nights would leave me trembling, but Aslam was indifferent. His focus was always on his work. I felt like a shadow in my own home, barely acknowledged, left to deal with my fears and insecurities on my own. When our first son, Asid, was born, my life changed. Suddenly, I had someone to care for, someone who needed me. I felt a newfound sense of purpose and strength. I wasn't completely alone anymore, but even as a mother, I still longed for Aslam's attention. His trips continued, and so did his lack of interest in family life. I prayed that he would spend more time at home, that he would notice the love and effort I put into raising our son. Our second son arrived a few years later, and while having two children brought me immense joy, it didn't change Aslam's behavior. He remained distant. His time at home was spent glued to his phone, consumed by his business. The love and attention I craved were nowhere to be found. I didn't just want money and a comfortable life. I wanted a connection, a bond with my husband that seemed to have disappeared. I started to feel as though I was raising our children alone, despite having him around. Even as my life revolved around our sons, I often thought about my parents. I missed them deeply, but I had burned those bridges myself. I had chosen to leave, to defy them, and to follow my own heart. Now I wondered if I had made the right choice. My father had warned me that my disobedience would come at a cost. And now, in the quiet moments of my life, I couldn't help but think he might have been right. Looking back, I can't say I regret loving Aslam, but I do wish I had listened more, understood more, and thought more carefully about what it means to build a life with someone. Love is important, but so are respect, understanding, and shared values. Without them, even the strongest love can feel hollow. My father's words echoed in my mind, a constant reminder that sometimes the people who warn us about the consequences of our choices aren't trying to hold us back. They're trying to save us from ourselves. My mother always tried to guide me towards better choices. She wanted to instill strong moral values and help me understand my faith, but I had a deep-seated resentment toward religious figures. Every time I saw someone with a beard or wearing traditional religious attire, I immediately assumed the worst. To me, they represented restrictions and a way of life I couldn't accept. I wanted to marry someone who would never place limits on me, someone who would let me roam freely, enjoy my independence, and never question my actions. When I finally married a man who fit that description, I thought I would be happy. But instead, I found myself feeling strangely unfulfilled, as if something vital was missing. Even though I had everything I had wished for, I often spent my nights awake, wondering why I still felt empty. Eventually, I resigned myself to the life I had chosen. I decided to focus entirely on my children and make them the center of my world. I wanted to ensure they received a good education, so I enrolled them in school and even convinced Islam to arrange for Arabic lessons. He hired the religious tutor to teach our children. The tutor was kind and patient with the kids, and they grew fond of him. However, his presence often made me uncomfortable. Occasionally, I would catch him glancing at me in ways that felt too intense, too intrusive. It wasn't every day, but when it happened, it left me uneasy. Still, I didn't want to disrupt the children's education. They had adjusted well to his teaching, and I couldn't bring myself to dismiss him. So I tried to set my discomfort aside and let things continue as they were. One day, Aslam left for another city despite my pleading. The weather had taken a turn for the worse. Dark clouds had gathered, and heavy rain was forecast. I begged him not to go, but he wouldn't listen. Once again, I was left alone with the children and the tutor while a storm raged outside. When the tutor arrived for the lesson that evening, I decided to ask him to stay until the rain subsided. I couldn't let him leave in such dangerous weather. I assumed the storm would pass quickly, and then he could go home. But instead of easing, the rain intensified. The pounding on the roof grew louder, the wind howled, and visibility outside was reduced to nothing. It felt as if the world beyond our walls had disappeared into the storm. I tried to keep calm, but the noise and the darkness made my heart race. I felt my chest tighten with fear, as if the rain was pressing down on me. I retreated to my room to lie down, hoping the weather would improve soon. Meanwhile, the tutor and the children stayed in the drawing room. I began to regret my decision to keep him here. If I hadn't asked him to stay, he would have already been on his way home, and I wouldn't have to deal with the tension of his presence. Now, it was too late. The storm had turned the streets into rivers, and the darkness outside was absolute. It wasn't possible to send him out into that chaos, so I had no choice but to let him stay. As I lay in bed, my thoughts churned. I kept glancing at the clock, waiting for the hours to pass. The night felt endless. I could hear the rain drumming against the windows, the thunder rumbling in the distance. It was a miserable, sleepless night. Finally, exhaustion overcame me, and I drifted off to sleep. But at some point, I was jolted awake by a strange sensation. It felt as if something was touching my feet, something that sent a shiver up my spine. It wasn't just my imagination. I could feel it clearly. My heart began to pound. The first thought that crossed my mind was of the tutor. I froze, trying to make sense of what was happening. I thought I heard someone moving in the room, then a faint sound of footsteps heading out. The room was pitch black, and I couldn't see anything. Still, I was certain someone had been there. Gathering my courage, I got up and rushed to the door. When I stepped out, I saw a faint glow from a small, rechargeable lamp we kept in the drawing room. The light illuminated the tutor, who was standing near the doorway. Anger surged through me. Without hesitation, I grabbed him by the collar and accused him of taking advantage of the situation. "How dare you?" I shouted. "I gave you shelter in my home, and this is how you repay me? You're trying to take advantage of me?" He looked at me in shock, clearly not expecting such an outburst. I pushed him away and said, "Get out of my house right now. I know you were in my room. I felt it. I know exactly what you were trying to do." The tutor, startled and defensive, began stammering. "Please, you're mistaken," he said. "I haven't done anything. I've been here with the children the whole time. I'm just waiting for the rain to stop so I can leave." I wasn't convinced. "Don't lie to me," I said. "You think I don't know what's going on? You think I can't tell?" "Listen," he said, trying to calm me down. "I'm not lying. You must have misunderstood. I'm not here to harm anyone. I'm just waiting for the storm to pass." He pointed out that he knew Aslam wasn't home and that he planned to leave as soon as the weather allowed. His words made me pause, but my mind was still racing. I didn't know what to believe. The storm continued to rage outside, and the tension inside the house was just as thick. I stared at him, unsure of what to do next. Seeing the distressed expression on his face, I lashed out in anger. Stop pretending. I know you came into my room, you touched my feet, and by the time I woke up, you had already slipped out. He vigorously shook his head in denial. I swear I didn't even approach your room, he said. I am a decent, honorable man. I would never do such a thing. Before I could continue accusing him, a piercing scream escaped my lips. A large black cobra was slithering swiftly across the floor of the room. My blood ran cold and my face drained of color. I jumped onto the couch, trembling with fear. My two children were still asleep nearby, and I couldn't help but worry for their safety. The tutor glanced at the snake, his expression calm, and remarked, I think this is what was in your room, not me. Thank God it didn't harm you. Without a second thought, the tutor fetched a wiper stick from the courtyard and began striking the snake. He showed no trace of fear. It was clear that he had dealt with snakes before. His swift movements and decisive blows made it obvious he knew what he was doing. Within moments, he had killed the snake and thrown it out of the house. Rainy weather often brings these creatures out, he said matter-of-factly. This area backs onto some undeveloped land, so it probably wandered in from there. Maybe it did end up in your room. Hearing this, a wave of embarrassment washed over me. I realized that my earlier suspicions about the tutor might have been unfounded. I felt a pang of guilt for assuming the worst about him. At the same time, I couldn't help but be grateful. He had just saved me and my children from a potentially dangerous situation. Perhaps I misunderstood your intentions, I admitted, still shaken by the ordeal. But if that's the case, why do you always look at me so strangely? I've felt an uneasiness in your gaze more than once. That's why I formed such a negative opinion of you. At this, the tutor lowered his head, his voice quieter and more measured. I'm sorry if I made you feel uncomfortable, he began. But you don't recognize me, do you? I used to live in your area. When you were a child, you studied Arabic with me for a while. Later, you began taking lessons from a female teacher, and I lost contact with your family. I knew your father well. After you left home, your father suffered a heart attack and passed away. Your mother was left alone, and when I heard about it, I began looking after her as best as I could. She had no one else. When I was offered this job here, I saw you and realized how much you had changed. The girl I remembered had transformed into someone I barely recognized. You've lost your sense of modesty, your sense of shame. Your father was a deeply religious man, yet it seems none of that influenced you. I can't help but feel sorrow when I see what's become of you. His words struck a chord within me. I didn't know what to say. As I stood there speechless, he continued, his voice filled with both sorrow and urgency. There's something else you should know, he said. The man you chose, Aslam, is not who you think he is. Did you know that you aren't his only wife? He has another family in this city. I teach his other wife's children as well. When he claims to be away on business, he's actually with them. Even tonight, he's with her, not on a business trip. When you brought me tea earlier, I could see that you were afraid. It's understandable. You've chosen this path for yourself, and now you're facing the consequences. It's not just the weather that frightens you. It's the life you've built, the choices you've made. I looked at you the way I did because I pity you. You turned away from your parents, from their guidance, and for what? To be with a man who doesn't honor or cherish you? The tutor's words pierced through me. It wasn't just what he said about Aslam's other family. It was the overwhelming truth that I had strayed so far from the values my father had tried to instill in me. I had turned my back on my family, disregarded their advice, and chosen a path that had led me to this moment. I feel sorry for you, he concluded, his voice heavy with disappointment. You've destroyed not only your life in this world, but also your prospects in the hereafter. With his head lowered, the religious tutor spoke quietly. Perhaps I shouldn't be telling you this, but you've only brought harm upon yourself by disobeying your parents. Aslam is not a good man. He never was. He isn't worthy of you. He's married twice, but that's not all. He's had relations with countless women. I've seen him with them myself. The words struck me like a thunderclap. I felt the ground shift beneath me as the truth dawned. My husband had another wife. All this time I had believed his stories about traveling for business, trusting him blindly. But now this revelation left me reeling. The tutor's words echoed what my father had always warned me about, that Aslam was a selfish, indulgent man who answered to no one. Without family, without siblings, he had no one to hold him accountable, no one to stop him from hurting me. At the time, I had been too blinded by love to listen. My father's advice had seemed like an obstacle to my happiness, something to rebel against rather than heed. I had thought I could change Aslam, that our love would overcome all obstacles. But now, faced with the news of my father's passing and the tutor's damning account of Aslam's behavior, I could no longer deny the truth. I was living the consequences of my choices, and they were painful beyond words. Seeing my shock, the tutor's tone softened. "Go to your mother," he said gently. "She needs you, and you need her. As for Aslam, focus on raising your children well. Teach them values. Steer them away from their father's path. And above all, pray to Allah for guidance, for yourself, for your husband, and for your family." The tutor stayed until morning, offering me comfort and wisdom. Before leaving, he revealed that he was the same friend my father had once wanted me to marry. "Your father was a righteous, kind-hearted man," he said. "He only wanted the best for you. I don't know if you'll ever forgive yourself, but know this. It's not too late to turn back to Allah, to seek His forgiveness and try to right your path." When he finally left, he gave me a deep blessing. I felt a wave of emotions, gratitude, regret, and a glimmer of hope. After he had gone, I looked at myself in the mirror for the first time in what felt like years. What I saw shook me to the core. I had changed, utterly and completely. Gone was the modest girl who once tried to follow the values her father had taught her. I had abandoned my prayers, abandoned my sense of shame. I had adopted the look and mannerisms of the kind of woman Aslam preferred, fashionable, modern, but spiritually empty. And where had that led me? I had lost my connection to my faith, to my family, and to myself. The realization was crushing. I immediately adjusted my attire, wrapping a scarf around my head, and fell to the floor in prayer. For the first time in years, I begged Allah for forgiveness. Tears streamed down my face as I poured out my guilt, my sorrow, and my plea for another chance. I asked Allah to forgive my disobedience, to forgive my arrogance, and to guide me back to the right path. Later that evening, Aslam returned home. He checked on the children and began preparing for bed, his usual routine, but I couldn't remain silent any longer. I confronted him, asking directly about his second wife. At first he denied it, but after a brief exchange, he admitted the truth. He confessed that he had been married before our wedding, and his first wife was still very much in his life. I felt as if the sky had fallen. My heart broke all over again. But instead of lashing out or demanding an explanation, I found myself falling silent. The weight of everything, the tutor's words, my father's warnings, my own guilt, pressed down on me. In that moment, I felt that I was being punished for my own sins. I had turned away from the values I was raised with, and now I was paying the price. Aslam's betrayal felt like a reflection of my own betrayal of my parents, my faith, and myself. Aslam didn't change. He continued spending more time with his first wife, leaving me and the children on our own. I realized that no amount of arguing or pleading would alter his nature. Instead, I turned inward. I began focusing on my children's upbringing, pouring all my energy into making sure they had the values and guidance I had once neglected. I taught them to be respectful, to value family, and to seek guidance in their faith. I also reached out to my mother after years of estrangement. To my relief, she forgave me and welcomed me back into her life. Her acceptance was like a balm to my wounded heart, and though I could never undo the past, I felt a sense of healing begin. As I look back on those years, I see only loss. I lost my father, I lost my sense of self, and I lost the innocence and joy I once had. But I also see lessons. I learned the weight of my choices, the value of humility, and the importance of faith. I've spent every day since then seeking forgiveness, not just from Allah, but from my father's memory. I wonder if he will forgive me in the hereafter. I hope he will see that I've repented, that I'm trying to live a better life now. To other women, I would say this: be cautious of men like Aslam. They may appear charming, but their lack of accountability and integrity can ruin not only your life in this world, but also jeopardize your spiritual well-being. The allure of love and freedom can blind you, but in the end, character, faith, and values matter far more than fleeting romance. If you ever find yourself facing a choice, remember my story. Think about what truly matters, because losing your way can cost you everything.